We all know the roller coaster of emotions. You're super excited, you finally just got all your parts in, and you're ready to install your new lift on your 4Runner. You work your tail off for however many hours it takes, and as always, you end up with some issues. Whether it be difficulties that you run into during the install, or problems once you go out for your first test drive, it's just a freaking bummer. You can spend a lot of time and money trying to sort out all these problems and figure things out. In my experience, though, there are a few common issues that do show themselves after installing a lift on a 4Runner. In this video, we're going to go over a few of those common issues to try to save you some time and money. Check it out. So first off, let's talk about just installing the coilovers themselves. We're talking about on the front end of the 4Runner. The instructions that come with your suspension lift will tell you that all you need to do is just remove the old coilovers and put in the new ones. They'll probably say something like, you might need to pry down on the lower control arm to get the coilovers to fit if it's a little snug. No, that's not going to work. I've tried this countless times, and let me tell you, without getting some really sketchy stuff going on, this is not going to work. I've tried to place a bottle jack in between the fender well and the upper control arm, and this will achieve what you need to happen, but it's pretty scary when you're trying to get that thing in there and everything looks like it's about to break loose on you. So I wouldn't recommend that. If you're all intertwined in the suspension trying to wedge the coilover in and it breaks loose, I think you can figure out the rest. So in the least, you're going to need to disconnect your sway bar end links and loosen the lower control arm bolts. Make sure you mark those before you loosen them. At this time, you can go ahead and try to check the fitment of the coilover, but there's a good chance you probably still won't be able to fit it in there. In that case that you still can't get it in, the best way to do it is to, once again, go ahead and disconnect the sway bar end links, loosen the lower control arm bolts, disconnect the lower ball joint, and also disconnect the outer tie rod ends from the spindle. This will give you plenty of chance to carefully place your coilover into its new home and ease up the lower control arm to the coilover lower mount. Most likely you'll need to jack up your lower control arm to get the ball joint to fit back in, and everything should be good from there. Next up are upper control arm issues. With all Toyota suspension lifts, it's recommended by most companies that you replace your stock upper control arms with aftermarket upper control arms. These are expensive, but I've found that it is best to go ahead and replace those. This is for multiple reasons. First up, your brand new shiny coilover spring is most likely going to come into contact with your upper ball joint area of the spindle when you get it full droop. This can cause paint to be chipped off of your spring in the least, and most likely it can cause further damage if you really slam these two parts together. Second of all, if you choose to run OEM Toyota wheels with your bigger tires for your lift, you're probably going to have some issues with rubbing on the inside of your tire to the upper control arm. If this is bad enough, it could definitely damage the tire, which we don't want. Lastly, with the stock upper control arms, you're going to have a pretty hard time getting good alignment specs. Mostly that comes down to camber, but it can affect your caster as well. I will say that with a previous 3rd Gen 4Runner I had, I was able to get away with my stock upper control arms. With aftermarket wheels that have a more negative offset, you don't have any issue with the inner tire rubbing, and I didn't have any contact with that spindle to the spring. I don't know why. Many vehicles are just different even if they're the same model. But on my current 4Runner, I was planning on running stock upper control arms since I had luck with that in the past. With this 4Runner, it wasn't even a chance. Even though the two models are the same, they were definitely different when it came to fitting everything in there. With the 4Runner I own now, I had major problems with contact between the coilover spring and the spindle. I had extreme binding of my upper ball joint to the point that the thing looked like it was going to break in half when I got down to full droop. And lastly, there's no way I could have gotten any decent alignment specs with the stock upper control arms. I went with JBA upper control arms and they were great. Shipped out super fast, they were a good price, and one last thing I think is awesome about them is that the upper ball joint is very easy to attain from your local Napa or Advance, just in case you have any issues with that, versus it being a proprietary ball joint. In dealing with a 3rd Gen 4Runner, I will say that hands down the most popular and most necessary problem to fix is the steering shaft slip joint. Toyota designed their upper end of the steering shaft in a way that in a front-end collision, the steering shaft is made to collapse on itself if the forces are applied in a certain way to keep the steering wheel and the column from being pushed in towards the driver. This shaft develops play in it over time. The way to tell if you have this issue is you can reach underneath of the dash with your left hand and grab onto the steering shaft. Hold it tightly while you take your right hand and move the steering wheel back and forth left to right. It'll be very easy to tell if you have this play in the steering shaft, just in the feeling in your left hand. So the correct way to fix this issue, if you do have it, is basically to replace the shaft. The shaft can be anywhere from $200 to $300. Keeping in mind that this is a safety mechanism that we do not want to defeat, it is best to replace the shaft, and that is what I recommend to do. However, for information use only, there are other ways that people have found to fix this issue by either tack welding the steering shaft at the slip joint or by drilling and placing a roll pin into the steering shaft to hold everything tight. However you choose to go about fixing this issue, it's a great one to do. Number one, out of all the things that I've replaced, including all front-end suspension parts, pieces, bushings, springs, ball joint, tie rod ends, everything, the slip joint fix was the greatest improvement of the handling of my 4Runner. It gets rid of a lot of the clunk noise that you get in the front end when going over bumps, and it gets a lot of the wandering out as well because your steering is much tighter once you fix this issue.